now should move forward to try to see what we can do to make up for that and to try to establish better relations. This is not the time to place blame. Now is the time to set things right. And as President Obama has said, and Secretary of State Clinton has said, this is time to push the reset button with the Russians. And I would add, probably, yes, let's push the reset button with Russia, and at the same time we should think about pulling the plug on NATO. So let's look at the future. Let's take actions today that will overcome past mistakes and to a future when Russia and America, which share common challenges and common enemies, will be a source of strength to each other. We have, over the last decade, inexplicably drifted toward a renewed adversarial relationship. Let us now take a serious look at what happens and recognize Russia to be an invaluable potential ally, an alliance that would be far more significant and viable than our current NATO alliance, which costs us far more than what NATO member states contribute to the international security operations and other type of activities that are vital to our country. Reagan gave us 2 decades of peace and prosperity because he did the right thing. The consequences of our actions since Reagan, however, are becoming more evident and more alarming each passing day. We must have the wisdom, courage, and political will to reconstruct our efforts rather than rely on diplomatic and military structures of the past. And let us note, Ronald Reagan did have the vision. I remember Ronald Reagan. I worked in the White House with Ronald Reagan. I remember him quite often making a stand on missile defense, which he believed in, but making it very clear to people this wasn't something that should be seen by the Russians as a hostile move, but instead he said that we should offer, if the Russians are willing to pull back their forces from their forward belligerent positions in Eastern Europe, that we should be willing to have missile defense as a joint project with the Russians. It would save us both money, and it would cover security for both of our countries. Ronald Reagan believed in that. That was not rhetoric. That was something he thought we could do. And instead, what we have done is move forward with missile defense and put it on Russia's border, not as something in cooperation with the Russians, but instead something that the Russians naturally view as a hostile act towards them. Now, this is not the way we should go. Ronald Reagan understood that. Ronald Reagan stood firm, but he stood firm with a dictatorship in Russia, not with a Russia that was longing to be part of the Western world as it is today, and at least as it was 10 years ago. We are confronted today with enormous foreign policy challenges and tasked with prevailing over those forces which will, if they can, will destroy America and our way of life and murder our countrymen on a massive scale in the process. 9/11 was only a taste of the potential mayhem radical Islamicists can and are willing to commit. By the way, we lost 3,000 civilians at 9/11. 3,000 people slaughtered before our eyes. That wasn't the intent. The intent was to murder everybody in those buildings and perhaps in all of the nearby buildings as the World Trade Center buildings were going to collapse into a busy New York. Yes, this was a plot to kill tens of thousands of Americans, and we better realize that that is the type of evil force we are up against. The national security threats before us are real and did not materialize out of thin air. But contrary to the dominant paradigm of our era, our ongoing relationship with NATO since the end of the Cold War has not worked to our benefit, nor has it made peace, stability, or our nation's security more likely. NATO has recently engaged in a number of operations around the world, from fighting the Taliban to combating pirates. But whether one views these missions as relatively successful or a failure, one can hardly look at them and not realize that the cost of our continued involvement in NATO certainly outweighs the benefits. In Afghanistan, The other 27 NATO countries sent a combined force of fewer than 5,000 troops, many in non-combatant positions. These 5,000 troops are there as part of a coalition. While a certain number of these fighters from our NATO partners are heroic, and we salute them, and are helpful, yes, and many of them do take risks, they are dwarfed in comparison to the number of American boots on the ground. 68,000 Americans serve in Afghanistan, and the number is rising. All of our allies in NATO, 5,000. And it has not escaped our attention that many of our NATO partners don't permit their troops to be placed where they might see combat. So this contribution, while appreciated, is in no way justifies the tens of billions of dollars that we pour into the NATO alliance. And now, as NATO expands to such countries as Albania, Croatia, and Bulgaria, it raises other serious questions. One of the primary tenets of NATO and a NATO membership is that any member will come to the defense of another member if that member is being attacked. But realistically, is the United States going to come to the aid of these other countries at any time? These slew of small countries, each of whom might have a border dispute with another country? And is the reverse of that proposition, worth the cost to us? Do we really need Albania and Croatia to come to our aid if we're attacked? The answer is obviously no. NATO's existence may be unnecessary for our interests. Let's also admit that NATO can be counterproductive. It's counterproductive to the peace at times. For example, by convincing the governments of new or potential member countries to aggressively and uncompromisingly deal with territorial disputes, we must realize that those disputes won't be settled by diplomatic negotiation. The government of Georgia is a perfect example. The United States, The United States discussion about NATO with the government of Georgia made it less willing to make compromises that were absolutely necessary for peace and stability in that region. Not only did Georgia not make the compromises, these talks about NATO emboldened them to take aggressive action, breaking a 7-year truce with its regional adversaries. The Georgians launched a brash, ill-conceived military attack on the 2 breakaway provinces of Abkhazia and Ossetia. The Georgians started it. They attacked first. All the while, the people of the United States were told over and over again, using the most sinister words, that Russia was the aggressor. It was the Russians' fault. We heard that over and over again. We are all Russians today, Senator McCain proclaimed. Again and again we were told that Russia was doing something evil and villainous. However, in a detailed second look at what happened in Georgia, a recent NATO report confirmed that it was Georgian troops that broke the truce. It was the Georgian troops that started this fight and brought on the confrontation. The point is that the Georgian government was emboldened by talks with them about NATO. They were the ones that broke the agreement that had kept the peace in that area after we talked to them about NATO. They invaded those 2 breakaway regions, which resulted in a considerable loss of life in Ossetia and Abkhazia, and it also brought on a counterattack from Russia, who had made agreements to maintain the peace with the people of Ossetia and Abkhazia, and the counterattack that was what? A reaction to the Georgian invasion. NATO's role was counterproductive, clearly. Furthermore, do we believe that the American military forces should have been involved in that distant conflict? Should they have been involved as part of a NATO commitment to Georgia? My goodness, That doesn't make any sense to me. That's all the way across the world. Yes, it's in Russia's backyard, so you know that they would be very involved and interested. But the United States is going to engage in a military confrontation with a power like Russia over a dispute, territorial